In this presentation, I'm going to talk about politeness in connection with gender. It is a widespread belief that women are polite and men impolite. More often than not, women and men even accuse each other of not behaving polite. So women complain often about men who never talk to them, and men criticize women because they hardly participate in discussions. This is a very sensitive issue which needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. In this presentation, I will try to show that women are not necessarily more polite than men, and that there is no reason for either sex to blame the other for impolite behavior. The key to understand this is the idea that women and men communicate for opposed purposes. They have a different attitude towards the function of language. To demonstrate this assumption, I set out by explaining Deborah Tannen's perspective on women's talk and men's talk. In order to support her, I will refer to some of Janet Holmes' works on linguistic politeness in connection with women and men. Before getting started, it's crucial to have a look what is meant by linguistic politeness. Janet Holmes argues that there are two main functions of language: the referential function and the effective function. Whereas the former is used to convey factual information, the latter is used to convey feelings and to reflect social relationships. Although every utterance expresses both functions, one is always dominant. The analysis of linguistic politeness focuses on the effective function of language. Janet Holmes defines politeness as behavior which actively expresses positive concern for others, as well as non-imposing, distancing behavior. So politeness is an expression of concern for the feelings of others. We have probably all come across the idea that women and men talk differently in one way or another. Literature offers a wide range of explanations why this should be the case. For Deborah Tannen, it's the socialization process which accounts for these differences in talk. Girls and boys are brought up differently, and they each learn the respective appropriate ways of interacting with others. That process already starts in early childhood and is reinforced by the sort of game boys and girls play. Boys tend to play outside in large groups, which usually have a leader. In competition, they try to identify a winner. Girls, however, rather play in small groups, and their games do not give space to show off particular skills. Accordingly, the language and its function used in these games vary significantly. Girls playing house presumably use a different kind of language than boys imitating a battle. Deborah Tannen states that men and women talk for different purposes. For most women, language is a means to develop relationships and establishing connections. Their topics are generally personal, like the famous troubles talk. Women's talk is talk for interaction. Tannen calls that rapport talk. Men, however, use language to negotiate status and display expertise. In a discussion, they may try to find out who knows more about sports. Furthermore, they see talk as a tool to exchange factual information on topics like political issues. Tannen calls that report talk, which is opposed to rapport talk. In the same way as the purpose of language between women and men differs, does also the domain where language is used. Report talk is primarily used in a public space. Rapport talk fits best into the private space. Accordingly, Men are likely to talk in public settings while staying fairly silent at home. Women usually speak more in private settings and often don't contribute much to discussions in larger groups. On the grounds that men and women use talk for different purposes, they also have different attitudes towards what sort of linguistic behavior is appropriate or polite in a particular context. To put this distinction made by Deborah Tannen in Janet Holmes' terms, while women set great store on the effective function of language, men focus on the referential function. Hedges and boosters are linguistic devices which are good examples to show that women and men use language differently. What is more, hedges and boosters may affect the perception of an utterance as polite or impolite. So what is a hedge? Hedges are linguistic devices which are aimed at reducing the imposition of an utterance experienced by the addressee. They attenuate the force or directness of a negatively effective utterance and are therefore considered to be instances of negative politeness. Here are a few examples. Tag questions. You moved to London 6 years ago, didn't you? Modal verbs. Could you pass me the salt? Lexical items. Perhaps we should look for another dress. And paralinguistic signals like hesitations or pauses. Boosters, on the other hand, underline the force of an utterance and are examples of positive politeness. Consider the following examples. Prosodic features. How wonderful you look today! Modal adverbs. He speaks Spanish incredibly accurate. And rhetorical devices like repetition. You're very, very talented. Hedges sometimes also soften positively effective utterances. In that case, they don't work as politeness devices. For example, I suppose that dress looks quite nice. Boosters can as well highlight the negative force of an utterance which is no longer an expression of politeness, like in "Stop that talking!" In examining whether women are more polite than men, many researchers have simply counted the amount of hedges and boosters used by the respective sex. Women happen to use more than men and are therefore supposed to be more polite than men. However, we need to keep in mind that there is no one-to-one relationship between a linguistic device and its function. This becomes clear when having a closer look at tag questions. Janet Holmes distinguishes between 4 different functions that a tag question can adopt. Epistemic modal tags are an expression of the speaker's uncertainty about the accuracy of a statement. The focus is on the referential meaning of language. Therefore, epistemic modal tags don't work as politeness devices. Today's the 14th, isn't it? Challenging tags are used to force the speaking partner aggressively to respond. They work as a booster since they intensify the force of an utterance. Despite the fact that they are boosters, challenging tags are certainly not considered to be polite. Like in "I'm the boss, okay?" Facilitative tags are hedges and serve as politeness devices because the emphasis is on the effective function. They invite the addressee to contribute to the conversation. You've taken up Zumba, haven't you? Softening tags are as well hedges but negative politeness devices. They are used to soften the force of a negatively effective utterance, such as criticism. It wasn't a clever idea to get drunk before your exam, was it? This figure summarizes Janet Holmes' findings. She points out that although the relative number of tag questions of women and men does vary, the different use remains stable. Men definitely use more epistemic modal tags than women, and it's only the men who use challenging tags. In the light of men's report talk, that outcome is not surprising. Challenging tags negotiate status. They put the speaker in a superior position. Epistemic modal tags have a referential function. They seek to confirm the accuracy of a fact. Women, on the other hand, use significantly more facilitative tags than men. That goes in line with women's concern for rapport. Facilitative tags are expressions of solidarity and consideration for other people's feelings and thoughts. Interestingly, softening tags are used more often by men than women, which is definitely inconsistent with the assumption that women emphasize affective meaning. Nevertheless, the rest of the evidence supports that women and men tend to interpret the purpose of language differently. Compliments are prime examples of positive politeness. They carry mainly affective meaning and are offers of solidarity. Paying a compliment is a way to create rapport. Janet Holmes defines a compliment as follows. A compliment is a speech act which explicitly or implicitly attributes credit to someone other than the speaker, usually the person addressed, for some good, possession, characteristics, skills, etc., which is positively valued by the speaker and the hearer. For example, "Wow, you're such a great cook." Even though compliments are predominantly affective, they can convey factual information. They may well be intended to be perceived as referential rather than affective. The referential aspect is, for example, the speaker's selection of what he or she comments on. A compliment can, for instance, express desire for a possession of the other person, or envy for a skill or appearance. Moreover, compliments are a positive, though critical assessment of that particular good. Depending on the relationship between the speakers, a compliment may be negatively evaluated or even be face-threatening. A good example are flattery compliments or sarcastic compliments. The negative evaluation usually occurs when there is a big social distance between the interlocutors, when they are not so familiar with each other or even strangers. Receiving a compliment can also be interpreted as patronizing. Deborah Tannen suggests that the compliment frames the speaker as one-up in a position to judge someone else's performance. So the speaker assumes to have the authority to evaluate others, which clearly creates an asymmetrical relationship. The receiver of the compliment must feel subordinate in terms of power, therefore regarding the compliment as a threat. The results of Janet Holmes' examination of compliments are the following. Clearly, women pay substantially more compliments to each other than men. Again, it's plausible that women ascribe a different function to compliments than men. Women tend to focus on the effective function of language. Consequently, compliments are a means to express solidarity and rapport. This attitude brings about frequent use of compliments. The assumption that women's speech style is rapport talk, which is most appropriate in private settings, matches with the fact that many compliments require familiarity with the addressee. Men seem to underline the darker side of compliments. They view them as evaluative judgments which may be face-threatening, especially when the social distance is big. As a result, they are reluctant to pay compliments. Report talk also includes status issues. Paying compliments to people with whom you're not so familiar is a problem. These compliments can be evaluated as flattery, which depicts a threat for the speaker because it puts him in a lower position. The fact that men pay more compliments to women than to other men can be interpreted in two ways. Either men are aware of the value women attach to compliments, or they see women in an inferior position, so paying a compliment does not threaten their status. This is an extremely complex question which I can't answer. Apologies are generally considered to be negative politeness devices. Janet Holmes describes apologies in the following manner. An apology is a speech act addressed to B's face needs and intended to remedy an offense for which A takes responsibility and thus to restore the equilibrium between A and B, where A is the apologizer, B is the person offended. Apologies usually restore social relations after an offense. The function of apologies is clearly effective, like in example 1. Oh, sorry, I thought you were a burglar. The fact that compliments carry effective and referential meaning is equally true for apologies. Besides expressing regret, an apology can be an admission of guilt or responsibility. Also, it is a means to convey bad news, like in example 2. Oh, I'm afraid I've broken your vase. Women and men use also different strategies of apologizing. Women use strategies which focus on the harmony of the relationship. They use strategies like expressing lack of negative intent. I didn't mean to hurt you. And recognizing the other's right to an apology. You're right, you deserve an apology. Men tend to use rather formal strategies. I'm sorry, or I apologize. Moreover, they use strategies like accepting the blame. That was my fault. Or expression of self-deficiency. Oh, sorry, I wasn't thinking. Janet Holmes' research shows that there is a strong tendency for women to apologize more often than men. Again, this distribution can be explained with regard to the different use of language between women and men. Women attach importance to rapport, so apologizing is indispensable for maintaining a harmonious relationship, especially after having offended someone. In addition, the way women apologize provides some evidence for the fact that they talk more in private settings. Men seem to consider apologies less important, or at least in private settings. That could be the reason why they use formal strategies. For them, apologies are mainly necessary when offending unfamiliar people, however not intimates. Men's report talk is also about status negotiation. Admission of the offense automatically puts the apologizer in a lower position in terms of status. Their way to avoid this is to acknowledge the blame and to express self-deficiency. In a nutshell, women's and men's talk follow different rules. Women's rapport talk means communication for interaction. Men's report talk means information exchange and status negotiation. When defining which sex is more polite, it's not enough to count linguistic forms, since there is no speech act or utterance which is intrinsically polite or impolite. It's only in a specific context when they reveal their full meaning. Women are not necessarily more polite than men. Considering rapport talk, women prefer talking in contexts where particular utterances work as an expression of positive politeness. So one could argue that women are not consciously trying to be polite. Their way of talking coincides with the general definition of what is polite. Men, on the other hand, have a different sort of talk, which takes into account other functions that a speech act can adopt. So when men don't pay the same amount of compliments than women, or apologize less frequent, it doesn't mean that they are rude. They just have another speech style. The perspective on politeness and gender that I've presented here is just one of many. Politeness itself is already very difficult to define and doesn't only depend on gender, but also on other variables like culture, age, class, and so on.